The most expensive mistake a person can make is believing someone else's strength belongs to them. The words hung in the air long after Ryan Mitchell spoke them. They landed harder because he said them calmly, not in anger, not during an argument, but with the certainty of a man who believed he was stating a fact. The private dining room overlooked downtown Chicago through walls of glass illuminated by city lights. Around the table sat several friends, business associates, and longtime colleagues who had gathered to celebrate Ryan's latest promotion. Crystal glasses reflected warm light. Conversations drifted between success stories and future plans. Laughter filled the room. To everyone else, it looked like a perfect evening. Danielle Brooks sat quietly beside Ryan, listening as she had listened through hundreds of dinners, conferences, and networking events over the years. Her black dress was elegant but simple. Her smile remained polite. Most people in the room knew Ryan well. Few truly knew her. They knew Ryan as the rising executive, the confident strategist, the man whose career seemed to accelerate every year. What they rarely noticed was how many of his decisions began as conversations at their kitchen table, how many opportunities Danielle had helped him evaluate, how many setbacks she had quietly helped him survive. Earlier that evening, one of Ryan's colleagues joked about marriage and independence. The comment drew laughter around the table. Then someone asked Danielle what she planned to do if she ever decided to start over on her own. The question sounded harmless enough. Several guests turned toward her with curiosity. Before Danielle could answer, Ryan laughed. Not loudly, just enough to capture everyone's attention. He swirled the ice in his glass and leaned back in his chair. "She would not last 6 months without me," he said. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Others looked down at their plates. Ryan continued, "I handle the business decisions. I handle the finances. I handle the opportunities. Danielle is amazing, but she has never had to do any of that alone." The room became strangely quiet. Danielle felt dozens of eyes shift toward her, waiting, watching, measuring her reaction. Ryan smiled as if he had delivered a harmless observation. "The truth is," he added, "she needs me more than she realizes." No one responded immediately. The silence felt heavier than the conversation itself. Danielle looked at the skyline beyond the glass. Thousands of lights stretched across the city. Somewhere out there, people were building businesses, solving problems, and creating futures nobody else could see yet. She wondered how many of them had once been underestimated too. Across the table, a woman cleared her throat and attempted to change the subject. The conversation moved on. New topics emerged. More laughter followed. Yet something inside Danielle had gone completely still. She was no longer listening to the discussion. She was listening to the certainty in Ryan's voice. The certainty that she could not survive without him. The certainty that her value existed only in relation to his success. Later that night, after the guests left and the city settled into silence, Danielle stood alone in the walk-in closet folding clothes into cardboard boxes. Ryan slept down the hallway, unaware that she had already made her decision. Piece by piece, shelf by shelf, she packed the life they had built together. There were no dramatic speeches, no confrontation, no tears, only quiet movement beneath the glow of a bedside lamp. Near the back of a drawer sat a worn leather notebook. Danielle picked it up and ran her fingers across the cover. Inside were pages filled with ideas she had been developing for years. Concepts Ryan had dismissed. Opportunities he had laughed at. Possibilities nobody else had taken seriously. She slipped the notebook into the final box and closed the lid. As dawn approached and the first sunlight touched the windows, Danielle carried that box toward the front door. Ryan believed she was walking away from her future. What neither of them knew was that she was carrying it with her. 3 weeks after leaving the house she once shared with Ryan, Danielle Brooks sat alone inside a one-bedroom apartment on the north side of Chicago. The space measured barely 700 square feet. The kitchen opened directly into the living room. The furniture consisted of a second-hand sofa, a small dining table, and several unopened cardboard boxes stacked against the wall. Through the window, elevated trains rattled across steel tracks every hour. The apartment was nothing like the suburban home she had left behind. Yet every object inside belonged to her. Every decision belonged to her. Every silence belonged to her. On her first morning there, she woke before sunrise and sat at the table with a notebook, a cup of coffee, and a spreadsheet she had created herself. The numbers were not impressive. Savings, rent, insurance, Utilities. Monthly expenses. For the first time in years, every dollar depended entirely on her own choices. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt strangely honest. During the final years of her marriage, Ryan often spoke about financial security as though he had created it alone. He never mentioned the consulting projects Danielle completed behind the scenes. He never mentioned the freelance contracts she managed at night. He never mentioned the countless opportunities she had researched, organized, and helped him evaluate before major career decisions. Those contributions had become invisible because they happened quietly. Invisible work is often mistaken for no work at all. The following months were not easy. Danielle applied for positions that never called back. She attended networking events where nobody recognized her name. She introduced herself to executives who seemed far more interested in speaking with people carrying larger titles. Some evenings, she returned home exhausted, removed her shoes near the door, and stared at the ceiling while wondering whether Ryan's prediction might eventually become true. Those moments never lasted long. Each time doubt appeared, she opened the worn leather notebook she had carried from the old house. Inside were pages filled with ideas accumulated over nearly a decade. Business models, market observations, operational solutions, customer retention systems, concepts she had developed while helping Ryan navigate his own career. Ideas he had often dismissed with a laugh and a quick change of subject. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Danielle attended a small business conference held inside a downtown hotel. Most attendees focused on technology trends and investment forecasts. During a panel discussion, one speaker described a growing problem facing mid-sized companies: employee turnover, inefficient workflows, rising operational costs. As the audience listened, Danielle realized she had already designed a solution years earlier. It was sitting inside her notebook. After the event ended, she remained in her chair while the room emptied around her. Her heart beat slightly faster than usual. Not from fear, from possibility. Back at the apartment that evening, she spread papers across the dining table. Charts, notes, financial projections, research. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass while city lights reflected across wet streets below. Hours passed unnoticed. Midnight became 2 in the morning. 2 became 4. By sunrise, a rough framework covered nearly every available surface in the room. Danielle leaned back and studied what she had created. For the first time since the divorce, she was not thinking about survival. She was thinking about building something. Across town, Ryan arrived at another executive meeting surrounded by assistants, schedules, and expectations. He never once wondered what Danielle was doing. He remained completely certain he already knew how her story would end. Meanwhile, 72 pages of notes rested on a small dining table in a modest apartment. And hidden within those pages was the first piece of a future neither of them could yet imagine. 6 months later, the dining table inside Danielle's apartment no longer looked like a temporary workspace. The cardboard boxes were gone. In their place stood 2 computer monitors, neatly organized folders, and a whiteboard covered with handwritten notes. What had begun as an idea inside a worn leather notebook had slowly transformed into something real. Not a company yet, not even a business. More like a framework, a solution designed for mid-sized companies struggling with efficiency, employee retention, and operational planning. Every morning before sunrise, Danielle sat at that table refining it. Every evening, she returned to improve it again. Progress arrived in inches rather than miles. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden success, only steady work repeated hundreds of times. Some days she questioned whether any of it mattered. Other days, she felt closer than ever to creating something valuable. One Thursday afternoon, she secured a meeting with the owner of a regional manufacturing company. The opportunity had arrived through a networking contact she barely knew. Danielle spent 3 nights preparing. She reviewed industry reports, built presentations, anticipated questions. By the time she entered the company's conference room, she understood their operational problems almost as well as they did. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, the owner thanked her politely and promised to stay in touch. Danielle recognized the phrase immediately. It usually meant no. She rode the elevator down feeling disappointed, but not surprised. Rejection had become familiar. Yet 3 days later, her phone rang. The company wanted to move forward with a pilot project. It was not a large contract. In fact, the payment barely covered expenses. but it represented something more important than money. It was proof that someone believed her ideas deserved a chance. Over the following months, Danielle worked closely with the client. She studied workflow bottlenecks, interviewed managers, and redesigned internal systems. Employees who once planned to leave decided to stay. Productivity improved. Costs decreased. The results were not dramatic enough for headlines, but they were significant enough for executives to notice. Soon another company requested a meeting. Then another. Small opportunities began appearing where none had existed before. Meanwhile, Ryan's career continued climbing. His photographs appeared in business magazines. He spoke at leadership conferences. Industry publications quoted him regularly. From the outside, his life looked unstoppable. Occasionally, mutual acquaintances mentioned Danielle during conversations. Ryan usually smiled politely before changing the subject. In his mind, her story had already been written. She was surviving. Nothing more. One evening, nearly a year after the divorce, Danielle attended a business networking event inside a downtown hotel ballroom. Most attendees arrived in groups. Danielle arrived alone. She spent the evening introducing herself, exchanging business cards, and listening carefully to conversations. Near the end of the event, she found herself standing beside a display window overlooking the Chicago River. The city lights reflected across dark water below. Behind her, voices blended into a constant hum. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment to pause. She thought about the apartment, the notebook, the endless hours of work, the uncertainty she carried every day. Then she remembered Ryan's voice. "You will never make it without me." The memory no longer hurt. It felt distant now, almost irrelevant. Her phone vibrated with an incoming email. Danielle opened it casually. Then she read it again. A national consulting association had reviewed one of her recent case studies and wanted to feature her work during an upcoming industry conference. She stared at the screen for several seconds. Around her, people continued talking, laughing, and exchanging introductions. Nobody noticed the moment. Nobody applauded. Yet standing beside that window, Danielle realized something important. She was no longer trying to prove she could survive alone. She already had. And somewhere beyond that realization waited a future far larger than anything Ryan had ever imagined for her. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday morning inside a plain white envelope resting among bills and advertisements in Danielle's mailbox. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable. She carried it upstairs, set it beside her coffee, and continued reviewing client reports before finally opening it an hour later. The letterhead immediately caught her attention. It belonged to one of the largest national business conferences in the country. Thousands of executives, consultants, investors, and company founders attended every year. Danielle had watched keynote speeches from previous events online while sitting at her small dining table, never imagining she would one day be invited herself. Yet there it was in black ink. They wanted her to present a case study on organizational transformation. For several moments, she simply stared at the page. Outside the apartment window, traffic flowed through the city exactly as it had the day before. The world had not changed. Yet something inside her quietly had. The conference took place 6 weeks later in Denver. By the time Danielle stepped into the convention center, the building already buzzed with conversations. Massive screens displayed schedules and speaker announcements. Business leaders moved between meeting rooms carrying coffee cups and portfolios. Some arrived surrounded by assistants and advisors. Danielle arrived alone, carrying a laptop bag and a presentation she had revised at least 20 times. Her session was scheduled for a smaller breakout room late in the afternoon. She expected a modest audience. Instead, nearly every seat was occupied. Managers, executives, consultants, and entrepreneurs filled the room. Danielle took a slow breath before beginning. Then she stopped thinking about herself entirely. She focused on the work, the system she had built, the challenges her clients faced, the practical solutions that produced measurable results. For 45 minutes, she spoke with the confidence that comes only from experience. Not theory, not ambition, experience. Questions continued long after the session ended. Several attendees remained behind to introduce themselves. Business cards changed hands. Opportunities emerged from conversations she never could have predicted. As the room gradually emptied, Danielle gathered her materials and prepared to leave. That was when she noticed a man standing near the back wall. He had remained silent throughout the presentation. Mid-50s, gray suit, calm expression. He carried no visible name badge and seemed completely comfortable attracting no attention. Yet something about him suggested that people usually paid attention when he spoke. Eventually he approached. "That was one of the most practical presentations I have heard all week," he said. Danielle thanked him politely. The man introduced himself. William Harper. The name landed a second later. Danielle recognized it immediately. William was not merely another attendee. He was one of the most respected investors in the country. His firm owned interests in dozens of companies across multiple industries. Articles had been written about him for years. Yet standing there, he seemed less interested in discussing investments than asking questions. They spoke for nearly 30 minutes. Not about money. About leadership, systems, long-term growth, company culture. The conversation felt surprisingly natural. William listened carefully and rarely interrupted. Before leaving, he handed Danielle a business card. "If you ever want to discuss scaling your work," he said, "call me." Then he disappeared into the crowd. Back at her hotel room that evening, Danielle placed the card beside her laptop and stared at it for a long moment. She had met influential people before. Most offered compliments. Few offered opportunities. Across the country, Ryan spent the evening attending another corporate networking event surrounded by familiar faces and predictable conversations. He remained convinced he understood exactly where Danielle's life was heading. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, a single business card rested on a hotel desk. And for the first time since she walked away from her old life, a door had opened that led somewhere far beyond survival. The business card remained on Danielle's desk for nearly a week before she finally called the number printed beneath William Harper's name. Not because she was intimidated, because she had learned that opportunities deserved careful consideration. During the years she spent helping Ryan navigate his career, she had watched countless people chase impressive titles and influential connections without understanding what they truly wanted. Danielle refused to make that mistake. When the call finally happened, it lasted less than 20 minutes. William asked direct questions about her work, her clients, and the systems she had developed. He listened more than he spoke. At the end of the conversation, he invited her to visit his firm's headquarters in New York. 2 weeks later, Danielle stepped into a conference room overlooking Midtown Manhattan. The office occupied the upper floors of a modern glass tower where sunlight reflected across neighboring skyscrapers. Analysts moved through hallways carrying reports and laptops. Large screens displayed financial data from around the world. Yet despite the scale of the operation, William seemed completely uninterested in appearances. He arrived carrying a notebook rather than a presentation. For the next 3 hours, they discussed business. Not investments. Business. Danielle explained how organizations lost efficiency as they expanded. How poor communication quietly damaged performance. How employee retention affected long-term profitability. She spoke about problems she had solved and mistakes she had learned from. William listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that forced her to think deeper. By the end of the meeting, he closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. "Most consultants talk about theories," he said. "You talk about outcomes." Danielle smiled slightly. "Outcomes pay the bills." William laughed. It was the first time she had seen him genuinely amused. Over the following months, their professional relationship continued growing. William introduced Danielle to executives facing operational challenges. Some became clients. Others became advisors. A few became long-term partners. Each opportunity expanded her network and strengthened her reputation. Yet what impressed William most was not her intelligence. It was her consistency. Danielle approached every project with the same level of preparation, whether the client was a small regional company or a national organization. She never treated success as an excuse to stop improving. Meanwhile, her original framework continued evolving. What started as notes inside a leather notebook had become a structured consulting model producing measurable results. More companies adopted it. More executives requested it. Slowly, the idea Ryan once dismissed as unrealistic began generating serious attention. One autumn afternoon, Danielle sat inside a conference room presenting results to the leadership team of a manufacturing company. Charts displayed significant improvements across multiple departments. Employee retention had increased. Productivity had improved. Operating costs had declined. When the presentation ended, the chief executive officer stood and shook her hand. "This changed our company," he said. The words stayed with her long after the meeting ended. Not because they boosted her ego, because they confirmed something she had suspected for years. The ideas she carried were valuable. They always had been. The difference was that she had finally given them room to grow. Later that evening, William invited her to dinner at a quiet restaurant overlooking the Hudson River. As they discussed future opportunities, he shared something unexpected. Several investment groups had started monitoring her work. Not because she was famous, because results attract attention. Danielle looked out at the city lights reflecting across dark water. The moment felt strangely familiar. Years earlier, she had sat in restaurants listening to Ryan discuss his future while her own ambitions remained tucked away inside notebooks. Now people were discussing hers. Across Chicago, Ryan continued advancing through his own career, unaware that Danielle's name had begun appearing in conversations taking place inside boardrooms he would eventually care about. And as the evening ended, William offered a simple observation that lingered in her mind during the flight home. "The most dangerous person in business," he said, "is someone everyone underestimated for too long." 2 years after receiving William Harper's business card, Danielle no longer worked from the small dining table that had witnessed the beginning of her journey. Her company now occupied an entire floor inside a renovated office building overlooking the Chicago River. Glass-walled conference rooms lined one side of the space. Analysts, consultants, and project managers moved between meetings carrying reports and laptops. The growth had happened gradually, almost quietly. One client became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became more than she could have imagined during those uncertain nights inside her apartment. Yet despite the expansion, Danielle maintained the same habits that had carried her through the difficult years. She still arrived before most employees. She still reviewed major proposals herself. She still believed that details mattered. On a rainy Monday morning, she stood near the office windows watching boats move slowly along the river below. Behind her, a team meeting had just concluded. Another national company had agreed to implement her operational framework across multiple divisions. It was the largest contract in the firm's history. The room buzzed with excitement after the announcement. Danielle accepted congratulations politely before returning to work. Success felt different than she once imagined. It was less like reaching a destination and more like discovering a larger mountain beyond the one you had just climbed. Later that week, William visited Chicago for a strategy session. Their professional relationship had become one of mutual respect. He remained an advisor, occasionally an investor, but never a rescuer. Danielle had built her company through her own decisions. William simply recognized value before most people did. During lunch, they reviewed growth projections and expansion opportunities. As always, William asked direct questions. "Do you remember the apartment?" he asked unexpectedly. Danielle smiled. "Every day." "Good." He nodded. People forget where they started when things begin going well. Danielle understood exactly what he meant. The apartment represented more than hardship. It represented clarity. Back then, every decision mattered because resources were limited. Every client mattered because opportunities were rare. Every success mattered because it had to be earned. Across the country, Ryan's life appeared successful from the outside. His title had grown. His responsibilities had expanded. Yet inside the company he worked for, subtle problems had begun emerging. Revenue targets became harder to achieve. Competition increased. Internal restructuring created uncertainty throughout several departments. Executives spent more time discussing risk than growth. None of it looked catastrophic. Not yet. But the confidence that once surrounded the organization had started fading. One afternoon, Danielle received an invitation to speak at an executive leadership summit in New York. Hundreds of senior leaders would attend. Several major investment firms were sponsoring the event. Her presentation focused on sustainable organizational growth, a subject she now understood better than ever. The conference ballroom was filled to capacity. As Danielle stepped onto the stage, she looked across rows of executives, founders, and investors. Years earlier, standing before an audience that size would have terrified her. Now she simply focused on the message. She spoke about leadership, adaptability, and long-term value. She spoke about building systems strong enough to survive difficult seasons. Most importantly, she spoke about the danger of underestimating people whose contributions happen quietly. The audience listened carefully. When the presentation ended, applause filled the room. Later that evening, several executives approached with partnership opportunities. One conversation lasted longer than the others. A representative from a private investment group expressed interest in future acquisitions involving operational consulting firms. Danielle listened politely without making commitments. Yet something about the discussion stayed with her. Back in her hotel room, she reviewed notes from the day while city lights shimmered beyond the window. Near midnight, an email arrived from William. Attached was a market report highlighting several companies experiencing growing financial pressure. One name near the bottom of the list immediately caught her attention. It belonged to the company where Ryan now held one of the most important leadership positions of his career. Danielle stared at the screen for several seconds before closing the report. Outside, New York continued glowing beneath the night sky. Inside the room, a future connection she never expected had quietly begun to take shape. The first signs appeared in places most people ignored. A delayed quarterly report. An unexpected leadership departure. A client contract that was quietly reduced instead of renewed. Individually, none of the developments seemed alarming. Together, they formed a pattern. Inside the company where Ryan Mitchell now served as a senior executive, confidence had begun giving way to concern. The organization remained profitable, but profitability no longer guaranteed stability. Competition had intensified. Market conditions had changed. Several strategic decisions that once looked promising now produced disappointing results. Meetings became longer. Discussions became more cautious. Questions became harder to answer. Ryan noticed the changes, but like many successful people, he believed experience alone would carry them through. For years, confidence had been rewarded. He saw no reason to abandon it now. One gray morning, executives gathered inside a conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. Financial projections filled the screen at the front of the room. Revenue growth had slowed for a third consecutive quarter. Cost reduction initiatives had failed to deliver expected savings. Several major clients had begun exploring alternative partnerships. Around the table, department leaders exchanged concerned looks. Ryan listened as analysts presented data. When the presentation ended, silence settled over the room. No one wanted to be the first to admit the situation had become serious. Eventually someone spoke. "We need outside expertise." The statement hung in the air. Consultants had been discussed before. Acquisitions had been discussed before. Strategic partnerships had been discussed before. This time, however, the conversation carried urgency. Across the country, Danielle spent her days navigating a very different reality. Her firm had expanded into multiple markets. New offices opened. Additional staff joined the organization. What once felt impossible had become routine. Yet she remained careful not to confuse growth with permanence. Success required maintenance, discipline, adaptation. Every achievement created new responsibilities. One afternoon, she sat with William reviewing potential expansion opportunities. Documents covered the conference table. Acquisition targets, market analyses, growth projections. Most involved consulting firms or operational service companies. Then one report caught her attention. The company name looked familiar. Not because she had worked there. Because Ryan worked there. Danielle studied the numbers quietly. The organization faced increasing pressure from investors. Leadership uncertainty had begun affecting performance. Market confidence was weakening. Nothing suggested collapse. But something important had changed. For the first time, the company needed help. William noticed her expression. "You know them?" he asked. Danielle nodded. "A little." William reviewed the report again. "Several investment groups are watching closely." He paused. "There may be opportunities if things continue in this direction." Danielle said nothing. Years earlier, she would have felt satisfaction seeing Ryan face challenges. Now she mostly felt distance. Time had a way of changing emotional priorities. That evening, after returning home, she stood beside the living room window overlooking the city. The skyline glowed against the darkness. Somewhere beyond those lights, thousands of people worried about careers, businesses, relationships, and futures they could not fully control. She thought briefly about the night Ryan declared she would never survive on her own. The memory felt strangely small now, almost insignificant compared to everything that had happened since. Meanwhile, inside another conference room several states away, Ryan listened as board members discussed strategic alternatives. New investors, restructuring plans, potential acquisitions. Nobody used the word crisis. Yet everyone understood the conversation would not be happening if the company remained strong. As the meeting ended, one board member mentioned a consulting and operational growth firm that had attracted considerable attention throughout the industry. Ryan barely noticed the name at first. Then he looked up. The room moved on to another topic, but he remained focused on those 3 words. Brooks Strategic Solutions. For reasons he could not explain, the name stayed with him long after the meeting ended. And for the first time in years, Danielle Brooks was no longer a forgotten chapter in his past. She was becoming part of his future. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Unlike the countless conference invitations and speaking requests Danielle received every month, this one carried a different weight. The sender was an investment consortium representing several major stakeholders in the company where Ryan worked. The subject line was brief: Strategic Partnership Discussion. Danielle read it twice before setting her phone down. Through the glass walls of her office, employees moved between meetings while the city flowed steadily beyond the windows. Everything appeared ordinary, yet she sensed something important approaching. Later that evening, she joined a video call with William Harper and several advisors. Financial reports filled the screen. Market projections followed. Then came the reason for the meeting. The company where Ryan held a senior leadership position had entered a difficult phase. Revenue growth had slowed considerably. Investor confidence had weakened. Several key divisions required restructuring. The board was actively seeking strategic partners capable of improving operations and restoring long-term stability. William listened quietly before turning toward Danielle. They need exactly what your company provides. No one disagreed. Over the previous few years, Brooks Strategic Solutions had become one of the most respected operational consulting firms in the country. Their systems consistently improved performance. Their reputation continued growing. More importantly, investors trusted results. Danielle studied the reports carefully. The numbers told a story she understood well. Not a story of failure, a story of missed adjustments. Leadership teams sometimes become so focused on protecting past success that they stop adapting to present realities. By the end of the meeting, discussions shifted toward potential partnerships, advisory roles, and investment structures. Danielle remained thoughtful throughout. She felt no excitement about Ryan's situation, no satisfaction, only professional curiosity. The following month, a formal meeting was scheduled in New York. Representatives from the investment consortium, board members, advisors, and potential strategic partners would attend. Danielle arrived early. The conference center occupied several floors inside a modern building overlooking Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline. Executives moved through hallways carrying portfolios and tablets. Assistants coordinated schedules. The atmosphere felt serious but controlled. Inside the primary meeting room, nameplates marked assigned seats around a long conference table. Danielle found hers near the front. Beside it rested a thick folder containing financial analyses and restructuring proposals. She reviewed the documents while participants gradually arrived. One by one, investors entered. Advisors followed. Board members greeted each other with measured professionalism. Then the doors opened again. Ryan walked into the room. For a brief moment, he stopped. Not dramatically, not visibly enough for most people to notice. Yet Danielle saw it immediately. Recognition, surprise, disbelief. Several years had passed since they last stood in the same professional space. Back then, Ryan viewed her future as something fragile, temporary, dependent. Now she occupied a seat among the people evaluating his company's future. Danielle acknowledged him with a polite nod. Nothing more. Ryan returned the gesture before taking his place across the table. Around them, conversations continued. Documents changed hands. Coffee was served. The meeting began. Throughout the morning, analysts reviewed financial challenges and operational concerns. Strategic alternatives were discussed. Investment scenarios were presented. Ryan participated professionally, answering questions and outlining initiatives. Yet every so often his attention drifted toward Danielle. Not because she interrupted. She rarely spoke. But when she did, the room listened. Her observations were concise, practical, precise. The same qualities that had transformed her company into an industry leader. As the session concluded, board members announced a second meeting would occur the following day. Final recommendations would be reviewed then. Participants gathered their materials and prepared to leave. Ryan remained seated for a moment longer. Across the table, Danielle closed her folder and stood. Their eyes met briefly. No resentment. No triumph. Just time. Years of it. Then she walked toward the exit. Behind her, dozens of executives continued discussing possibilities. Ahead of her waited another meeting. And by this time tomorrow, the role she would play in Ryan's future would finally become impossible to ignore. The final meeting began at 9 o'clock on a clear Manhattan morning. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long reflections across the polished conference table. Investors, board members, advisors, and senior executives gradually filled the room. Coffee cups rested beside thick folders containing reports, recommendations, and financial projections. The atmosphere remained professional, but beneath the calm surface, everyone understood the importance of the day. Decisions made inside this room would influence the future of an entire company. Ryan arrived early. He reviewed documents, exchanged greetings, and settled into his seat with the composed confidence he had carried throughout most of his career. Yet something felt different. For the first time in years, he was entering a meeting without knowing how it would end. Across the table, Danielle sat quietly reviewing notes. She wore a navy business suit and the same silver watch she had worn for years. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention, yet attention found her anyway. Not because of who she used to be, because of what she had become. The meeting opened with a review of strategic options. Analysts presented findings. Advisors outlined recommendations. Several investment groups discussed potential structures for future growth. Then William Harper stood. The room became noticeably quieter. William moved through the financial reports with characteristic precision. He outlined market realities, operational concerns, and opportunities available to the company. Finally, he introduced the proposal receiving the strongest support from investors and board members. Brooks Strategic Solutions would lead the operational transformation initiative moving forward. In addition, a newly formed partnership structure would place Danielle in direct oversight of the implementation process, with authority extending across multiple divisions. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then board members began asking questions. Danielle answered each one calmly. She discussed strategy, accountability, performance metrics, and long-term objectives. Every answer reflected years of experience, years of rebuilding, years of proving herself without demanding recognition. As the discussion continued, support around the room became increasingly clear. The vote occurred shortly before noon. One by one, directors cast their decisions. The results were decisive. The proposal passed. Applause did not follow. Major business decisions rarely create dramatic celebrations. Instead, there was something more meaningful. Confidence. Around the table, people began discussing next steps as though the future had already shifted into place. Ryan remained silent for several moments. Through the windows behind Danielle, the city stretched toward the horizon. He looked at the woman sitting across from him and remembered another room years earlier. Another audience. Another moment when he spoke with absolute certainty. "You will not survive without me." At the time, he believed he was describing reality. Now reality sat directly across from him. Danielle had not merely survived. She had built something larger than either of them imagined. More importantly, she had done it without bitterness, without public revenge, without trying to prove him wrong. She simply kept moving forward until the results spoke for themselves. After the meeting ended, participants gathered their materials and slowly departed. Conversations filled the hallway outside. Schedules were discussed. Follow-up meetings were arranged. New plans were already taking shape. Ryan remained behind briefly, organizing papers he no longer seemed interested in reading. Eventually, he stood and approached Danielle. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ryan glanced toward the skyline. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. Danielle looked at him with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the meeting. "No," she replied. "You were wrong about what I could become." There was no anger in her voice. No victory, just truth. A few minutes later, she left the conference room and stepped into the hallway where advisors and executives waited. New responsibilities, new challenges, new opportunities. Life moving forward once again. As she walked toward the elevators, sunlight streamed through the glass walls surrounding the building. Years earlier, she carried a single notebook out of a house where someone believed she needed him to survive. Today she carried an entire future built by her own hands. And in the end, the greatest victory was not that she influenced Ryan's future. It was that she finally owned her own.